I've always been a person who prefers the quiet. There's a certain comfort in being alone, walking the familiar streets of my neighborhood when most people are tucked inside, going about their evening routines. The city, especially at night, feels different, less chaotic, more personal, like it's holding its breath for a moment. So, on that night, when I stepped out into the cool air, I was just doing what I often did, clearing my head after a long day. It had been raining earlier, and the wet pavement reflected the dim streetlights, giving the whole neighborhood a soft, muted glow. The streets were quieter than usual, almost too quiet, as if the rain had absorbed all the noise. I had no particular destination in mind, just wandered a few blocks down, taking in the subtle rhythm of the night. I walked past the usual shops, the bakery with the soft light glowing from the window, the small grocery store with the door propped open to let the night air in. It was as I turned down an alley near the back of the laundromat that I saw it. A cat. It was small, sleek, black with a few white patches on its paws and chest. Its fur shimmered in the dim light, its eyes bright and alert, watching me as if it had been waiting. It didn't move immediately. Instead, it stared at me for a long moment, as if gauging whether I would follow. Then, without a sound, it turned and slipped through the narrow passageway between the crumbling brick walls of the alley. Now, normally, I wouldn't have followed. I've always been cautious, aware that alleyways aren't the safest places to wander, especially at night. But something about the cat drew me in, its fluid movements, its quiet elegance. It almost felt deliberate. As if it had a purpose, and I was meant to be part of it. I followed without thinking. The alley was darker than I expected, and the buildings on either side loomed higher than usual, casting long shadows across the ground. The cobblestones beneath my feet were slick from the earlier rain, and the faint smell of damp earth and wet brick filled the air. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound, my footsteps muffled by the constant drumming of water dripping from the eaves above. The cat moved ahead of me, its tail flicking slightly, and I kept a few paces behind, just close enough to stay in its wake. We passed the usual things, discarded boxes, a broken broom leaning against the wall, a rusted can of something that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The alley seemed familiar, but there was something off about it that I couldn't quite place. The walls on either side were old, weathered, the kind that seemed to breathe with time, but tonight they felt different. They felt alive. As the cat led me deeper into the alley, it suddenly stopped in front of a wall. At first, I thought it had simply paused to scratch or sniff around, as cats often do, but there was something strange about the way it moved. It approached the wall slowly, cautiously, as though it was checking to see if it had permission to pass. The cat's body stiffened, and then, in a movement that was too fluid to be real, it slipped sideways, into the wall. No hesitation. No warning. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. I froze. For a moment, I thought my mind had played some trick on me. Maybe I hadn't been paying close enough attention, or the shadows had shifted in a way that made the cat appear to disappear. But no. I walked closer, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath quickening as I leaned toward the wall where the cat had vanished. There was nothing. No crack in the brick. No space between the stones. Just the smooth, cold surface of the wall, unchanged. I stepped back, a feeling of unease creeping slowly through my veins. I looked around, half expecting the cat to emerge from the shadows, to reappear with a soft meow as if nothing had happened. But the alley remained still, too still. The air felt heavy, and the faint sound of dripping water seemed to echo louder than before. My eyes darted across the alley, searching for any sign of movement, but nothing stirred. The night was suffocatingly quiet. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I had just seen. My mind grasped for a rational explanation. Perhaps the cat had slipped behind something, or maybe it had darted into one of the small doorways that lined the alley. But the longer I stared at the smooth wall, the more certain I became that I had seen what I had seen. The cat had disappeared into the wall. With a sudden jolt, I turned around and started walking back the way I came. My pace quickened, my footsteps growing louder against the wet pavement. The further I walked, the more the alley seemed to stretch behind me, the buildings on either side looming higher and closer. The streetlights at the end of the alley felt farther away than they should have, their light dim and distant. I reached the end of the alley, but the familiar street was no longer there. Instead, I found myself at the entrance of another alley. A narrow, dark passage, barely wide enough for me to turn around in. The walls on either side were unfamiliar, taller, more imposing. The smell of dampness was stronger here, and the air felt colder. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the street, the familiar buildings, but there was nothing. Just more brick walls, more shadows stretching across the ground, more of that same oppressive silence. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but then I saw it. At the far end of the new alley, the same cat. It was sitting perfectly still, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And it was looking directly at me. Without thinking, I moved toward it again, compelled by some strange pull. But as I got closer, the same thing happened. The cat stood up slowly, its movements graceful and deliberate, and it turned toward the far wall. And then, as if it were nothing more than an ordinary part of the night, it walked straight into the brick. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind struggling to catch up with what I was seeing. The cat had vanished into the wall once again, leaving only the faintest ripple in the air behind it. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the surface of the wall. It was solid, cold, unmoving. I didn't know how long I stood there, my mind swirling with confusion and fear. I wanted to run, to leave the alley and never look back, but something held me in place. Something about the cat, something about the way it moved, the way it seemed to beckon me into this strange, shifting world, made it impossible to turn away. Finally, with a trembling breath, I turned and began walking down the alley, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know where the alley would lead, or if it would ever end. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter where I went, I would find myself back at that wall. Back with the cat. And that it would disappear into the wall again. Waiting. Always waiting for me to follow. The evening was unusually quiet, a calm that felt both serene and unnerving. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the cobblestone road, and the air was cool with the faint smell of wet leaves. I was out for my usual evening walk, nothing out of the ordinary, just a way to unwind, clear my mind. The neighborhood was peaceful, familiar in its quiet hum, the kind of place where people smiled and nodded when they crossed paths, and doors were always open for a chat. It was a small town, and everyone knew everyone. Or so I thought. As I passed by the row of houses on the corner, I noticed something strange. It wasn't the house itself, but rather the way it stood there, almost too still. A corner house, with ivy climbing up the brick walls and a single window that was cracked open just a sliver. The paint was peeling on the doorframe, and the lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks. But there was something about it, something that seemed wrong. I had passed this house many times before. It was one of those homes that blended into the background of the neighborhood. Nothing special. And yet tonight, as I walked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something that had changed in the silence. I stopped, my feet halting without thought. My eyes lingered on the door. It was dark, the shadows cast by the overhanging trees making it hard to see clearly. But there was a faint sound now, distant but distinct, a soft knock, barely audible over the whisper of wind. I looked around, but the street was empty. No one was walking by. No cars passed. Only the sound of my own heartbeat seemed to fill the space. Curiosity got the better of me, as it often does in moments like this. I walked up the front steps, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. My hand hovered over the doorbell, but before I could press it, I heard the knocking again. It was louder this time, more insistent, coming from the other side of the door. 3 knocks. quiet but firm. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be knocking at this hour? The house seemed so abandoned, so untouched by time. But here it was, the unmistakable sound of someone knocking. It was too strange to ignore. I knocked back, instinctively. A soft tap on the door, just to see if there was an answer, some sign of life behind it. Silence. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I had misheard the sound. But then the knocking came again. Louder now. 3 distinct knocks, followed by a brief pause, then another. I reached for the door handle, a sense of hesitation filling me. I had no reason to be here. No reason to investigate. But something felt compelling, something pulling me toward that door, like it was calling me, asking me to open it. I twisted the handle slowly. It turned. The door creaked open, not from any force I applied but as if it had been waiting for the motion, ready to reveal whatever lay behind it. The hallway inside was dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and something else, something stale, as if the house hadn't been lived in for years. I could barely make out the outline of the walls, the faintest glimmer of old wallpaper peeling at the edges. There was no light on inside, no sounds of movement. Just the oppressive stillness. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet. The house felt like a relic, a forgotten space that had once been full of life, but now it seemed hollow. A shell. The knocking had stopped. I stood still for a moment, listening. The silence was suffocating, filling the empty space of the house. I felt the strange pull to move forward, to see what lay deeper within. But with every step I took, the air grew heavier. The stillness grew more profound, more unsettling. I reached the living room, or at least what should have been the living room. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, the outlines of old couches and chairs faintly visible beneath the white fabric. The windows were all shut tight, and the curtains were drawn. It was impossible to tell how long the room had been this way, days? Years? Decades? Then, at the far end of the room, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A figure. It was standing at the window, facing away from me, as though waiting. Its shape was obscured by the curtain, but the outline was unmistakable. A person. Tall, slender, unmoving. I called out, instinctively, "Hello?" But my voice seemed to vanish the moment the words left my mouth, swallowed by the thick air in the room. The figure didn't respond. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart racing, and then another. Each movement felt more unnatural than the last, as though I wasn't meant to be here. As if this place wasn't supposed to let me in. When I was close enough, the figure turned. It wasn't a person. At least, not in the way I expected. It was a mannequin. A tall, lifeless figure, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, its face featureless and blank, an eerie, smooth surface where eyes and a mouth should be. Its hands were positioned in front of it as if holding something, but there was nothing in its grasp. The clothes were old, frayed at the edges, as if they hadn't been worn in years. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. The house felt colder now, the air dense with something I couldn't place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would someone leave a mannequin standing like this, in the dark, in a house that seemed abandoned? As I turned to leave, I saw something else out of the corner of my eye. The door, the one I had opened, was now slowly creaking shut. The handle turned, gently, but there was no one behind it. I rushed toward it, my feet stumbling over the floorboards, but as I reached for the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. A hand that wasn't there before. I whipped around, but there was no one. The room was empty again, just the mannequin, still standing motionless by the window. I hurried back outside, my breaths ragged, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The door slammed behind me as I stepped back onto the porch, but I didn't turn to look at it again. Instead, I ran. I ran without thinking, down the stairs. The evening was unusually quiet, a calm that felt both serene and unnerving. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the cobblestone road, and the air was cool with the faint smell of wet leaves. I was out for my usual evening walk, nothing out of the ordinary, just a way to unwind, clear my mind. Down the path, away from the house. When I reached the street, I glanced back once, expecting to see lights flickering on in the house, someone moving about behind the window. But there was nothing. The house stood silent in the dark, just as it had before. I didn't know who lived there, or who had lived there. I didn't know who had been knocking at the door, or who had left the mannequin in the window. But the next morning, when I passed by the house again, it was as if nothing had happened. The lawn had been mowed. The door was firmly closed. No trace of the eerie figure, the knocking, or the unsettling mannequin. I told myself it had been a trick of the mind, a strange moment that didn't make sense. But there's one thing I can't shake. Every time I walk past that house now, I feel as though someone is watching me from behind those curtained windows, waiting for me to return. And I can't help but wonder, who, or what, is knocking on the door now? The night was heavier than usual, pressing down on the street with a weight that felt suffocating. The air was thick, thick enough to taste, with that lingering humidity after the rain had passed but left behind the dampness. The kind of humidity that clings to your skin and makes your clothes feel uncomfortable, as if they've absorbed all the wetness from the world around you. I had been walking for hours, trying to clear my mind, but it felt like the night was pushing back against me, trying to hold me in place. The world felt muffled, as if I were underwater, the usual sounds of the city softened by the thick layer of fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The street was quiet, far quieter than it should have been for that time of night, especially in this part of town. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of people talking in their apartments or the distant hum of traffic. Just the occasional rustle of the trees and the soft drumming of raindrops from earlier on the leaves. Even the usual street noise felt somehow distant. As I walked further down the street, I noticed the streetlights were flickering. Nothing new, really. They often flickered here, this area wasn't exactly the best maintained. But tonight, the flickering felt different, like the lights were trying to fight against something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the shadows stretching in odd ways as I moved down the sidewalk, but then it happened again. One of the streetlights buzzed loudly. It wasn't the usual hum or flicker I had gotten used to. This sound was sharp, almost mechanical, like a broken wire struggling to keep the light alive. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes drawn to the glow of the streetlight overhead. It buzzed again, louder this time, and then there was a strange, unsettling pause. Everything felt still, too still. I thought about walking past, ignoring it, but the light drew me in like something almost familiar. The world felt muffled, as if I were underwater, the usual sounds of the city softened by the thick layer of fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The street was quiet, far quieter than it should have been for that time of night, especially in this part of town. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of people talking in their apartments or the distant hum of traffic. Just the occasional rustle of the trees and the soft drumming of raindrops from earlier on the leaves. Even the usual street noise felt somehow distant. As I walked further down like I had to see it, had to make sense of it. And then, as I stared up at the flickering light, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, so soft I could hardly believe it, yet unmistakable. My name. It was barely a sound at first, just the faintest breath against my ear, like a voice carried on the wind. But I knew what it was. Lucas. I froze. The air seemed to stop around me. My pulse quickened, a cold, prickling sensation creeping over my skin. I glanced around, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next, expecting someone to be standing nearby, hidden in the fog, watching me. But no one was there. The street was empty as it had been when I'd started my walk. I looked back at the streetlight. It was still buzzing, flickering erratically, but now I could swear the light seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, almost alive, like something was moving behind it, beneath it. It felt like the light itself was breathing, its glow undulating in time with my heartbeat. And then, once again, that whisper, quieter now, like it was pressing through the air itself. Lucas. The sound was almost gentle, the way a name is spoken by someone you've known for a long time, someone who knows you too well. My stomach twisted. My feet felt heavy, as if they were stuck in place, and yet I couldn't stop myself from walking closer to the light. I don't know why. Maybe curiosity. Maybe fear. But something inside me made me move toward it, made me listen. The streetlight buzzed again, and the air around me thickened, like the atmosphere itself had become too dense to breathe easily. The fog seemed to press closer, curling around the base of the light. I could feel it now, a subtle pressure, as if the light was pulling at something inside me. Something deep, something old. I stepped forward, my steps almost silent against the wet pavement. The light flickered again, and I stopped beneath it, my head tilted upward. The streetlight hummed louder, the buzzing now vibrating through the soles of my shoes, through my bones. And then, as if it had been waiting for me, it spoke again. This time, it was different. It was not a whisper. It was clearer, sharper. A voice, not unlike the one I would hear if someone were standing next to me, right beside me. I know you're here, Lucas. I jerked backward, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was so clear now, so close, it felt like it was coming from within me, like the streetlight itself was speaking directly to my mind. I glanced around again, desperate to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. The street was empty, and the fog curled up the sidewalk in thick, ghostly tendrils, swallowing everything in its path. I know you're here, waiting. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. I started walking again, faster now, almost running, but my feet felt slow, as if the street itself was holding me back. Down the path, away from the house. When I reached the street, I glanced back once, expecting to see lights flickering on in the house, someone moving about behind the window. But there was nothing. The house stood silent in the dark, just as it had before. I didn't know who lived there, or who had lived there. I didn't know who had been knocking at the door, or who had left the mannequin in the window. But the next morning, when I passed by the house again, it was as if nothing had happened. The lawn had been mowed. The door was firmly closed. No trace of the eerie figure, the knocking, or the unsettling mannequin. I told myself it had been a trick of the mind, a strange moment that didn't make sense. But there's one thing I can't shake. Every time I walk past that house now, I feel as though someone is watching me from behind those curtained windows, waiting for me to return. And I can't help but wonder, who, or what, is knocking on the door now. The buzzing from the light grew louder, the sound grating against my skull, sending a wave of discomfort through my body. I could still hear the voice, low, almost inaudible beneath the sound of the light, but I could feel it crawling inside me, digging into my thoughts, into my memories. You know me, Lucas. You remember. That was when I realized, the voice was familiar. It wasn't just speaking my name. It was speaking to me like it knew me, like it had known me for years, like it had been waiting for me to remember something. Something I had forgotten. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, and I felt like I was being pulled closer to the streetlight. My hands trembled, my vision narrowing as I stared up at the light, watching as it flickered one last time, its glow now so bright it almost seemed to blind me. And then, it was gone. The light went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. The buzzing stopped. The whispers ceased. The night, which had felt so alive, grew. The world felt muffled, as if I were underwater, the usual sounds of the city softened by the thick layer of fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The street was quiet, far quieter than it should have been for that time of night, especially in this part of town. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of people talking in their apartments or the distant hum of traffic. Just the occasional rustle of the trees and the soft drumming of raindrops from earlier on the leaves. Even the usual street noise felt somehow distant. As I walked further down the street, I noticed the streetlights were flickering. Nothing new, really. They often flickered here. This area wasn't exactly the best maintained. But tonight, the flickering felt different, like the lights were trying to fight against something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the shadows stretching in odd ways as I moved down the sidewalk, but then it happened again. One of the streetlights buzzed loudly. It wasn't the usual hum or flicker I had gotten used to. This sound was sharp, almost mechanical, like a broken wire struggling to keep the light alive. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes drawn to the glow of the streetlight overhead. It buzzed again, louder this time, and then there was a strange, unsettling pause. Everything felt still, too still. I thought about walking past, ignoring it, but the light drew me in like something almost familiar. The day had been like any other, or at least it had started that way. I woke up late, my apartment still heavy with the sleep I hadn't quite shaken off, and stumbled through my usual morning routine: coffee, shower, checking my emails, the world outside still seeming distant and irrelevant as I moved through the motions. The weather was typical for this time of year, a gray sky with that thick layer of mist that clung to the city, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay inside under a blanket, watching the world pass by. I didn't have much. I don't know why I looked at him so closely. Maybe it was the way he sat, as if he were in his own world, or perhaps the strange quiet around him, like the coffee shop's usual buzz was dulling around his presence. And that's when I saw the date on the newspaper. At first, I thought I had misread it. Maybe I was still half asleep, or perhaps the glare from the window had distorted the print. I blinked and looked again. October 12, 2033. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't process it. I thought maybe I had read it wrong. Maybe the newspaper was old, some discarded piece of history, something left behind by a previous customer. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, October 12, 2033. I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The man seemed so absorbed in the paper, so detached from everything around him. The coffee shop noise, the clink of cups, the soft murmur of conversations, seemed to fade into the background. It was just him, and that newspaper, with its impossible date. I glanced around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed. The barista was behind the counter, busy with orders. A couple sat at a nearby table, laughing softly. No one else seemed to care. I tried to focus on something else. Anything else. But my mind kept returning to that date. 2033, 10 years from now. The future. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced back at the man. He hadn't moved. His hand was steady as he turned the page, absorbed in whatever article he was reading. I thought I could almost see the headline now, but I couldn't make it out. Something about it felt wrong. A shiver ran down my spine, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see, like I had crossed some invisible line. I stood up, my hands suddenly clammy, my heart racing. I told myself I was just being ridiculous. There was no reason to make a scene. No reason to ask him about the date, about the paper. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something about the whole situation felt too surreal, too out of place. I grabbed my coffee, moving toward the door. But as I passed by his table, I couldn't resist a final glance. He was still reading the paper. But this time, his head was tilted slightly to one side, as if he were listening for something. Or maybe watching me. I froze, mid-step. His eyes weren't on the paper anymore. They were on me. He wasn't staring at me in a way that would make most people uncomfortable. No, it was something far worse. It was as though he had been waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to realize that I wasn't supposed to be seeing this at all. His gaze was calm, unblinking, and his lips curled up just slightly in a knowing smile. The kind of smile someone gives you when they know a secret. A secret you don't want to know. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It felt as though the air in the room had suddenly thickened, pressing against me, suffocating me. The strange buzzing in my ears returned, and I felt dizzy, my vision blurring. Then, in the quietest voice, as though it were coming from inside my own mind rather than his mouth, he whispered, "You're not supposed to know yet." I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, my coffee cup slipping through my fingers and landing with a soft thud on the floor. People around me glanced over, but no one seemed to pay much attention. I felt like I was trapped in some sort of dream, the kind where you know you should wake up but can't. I didn't look back at him as I turned and fled the coffee shop, my legs moving without my consent, carrying me out into the cold, foggy night. I don't know why I ran. Maybe it was the strangeness of the moment. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me. But all I knew was that I couldn't stay there any longer. The buzzing from the light grew louder, the sound grating against my skull, sending a wave of discomfort through my body. I could still hear the voice, low, almost inaudible beneath the sound of the light, but I could feel it crawling inside me, digging into my thoughts, into my memories. "You know me, Lucas. You remember." That was when I realized, the voice was familiar. It wasn't just speaking my name. It was speaking to me like it knew me, like it had known me for years, like it had been waiting for me to remember something. Something I had forgotten. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, and I felt like I was being pulled closer to the streetlight. My hands trembled, my vision narrowing as I stared up at the light, watching as it flickered one last time, its glow now so bright it almost seemed to blind me. And then, it was gone. The light went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. The buzzing stopped. The whispers ceased. The night, which had felt so alive, grew. The world felt muffled, as if I were underwater, the usual sounds of the city softened by the thick layer of fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The street was quiet, far quieter than it should have been for that time of night, especially in this part of town. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of people talking in their apartments or the distant hum of traffic. Just the occasional rustle of the trees and the soft drumming of raindrops from earlier on the leaves. Even the usual street noise felt somehow distant. As I walked further down the street, I noticed the streetlights were flickering. Nothing new, really. They often flickered here, this area wasn't exactly the best maintained. But tonight, the flickering felt different, like the lights were trying to fight against something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the shadows stretching in odd ways as I moved down the sidewalk, but then it happened again. One of the streetlights buzzed loudly. It wasn't the usual hum or flicker I had gotten used to. This sound was sharp, almost mechanical, like a broken wire struggling to keep the light alive. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes drawn to the glow of the streetlight overhead. It buzzed again, louder this time, and then there was a strange, unsettling pause. Everything felt still, too still. I thought about walking past, ignoring it, but the light drew me in like something almost familiar. And then, a week later, I saw it again. I was at a different coffee shop, sitting alone at a table near the window. I had been avoiding that one spot, the one where I had first seen the man, but I thought it was safe here. I was wrong. There he was. Not across the room, not in some distant corner. No. He was sitting at the table right next to mine. And once again, he was reading a newspaper. I didn't need to look at the date. I knew it would be there. October 12, 2033. And this time, when I looked up at him, his eyes met mine instantly. That same KN. It was one of those days when everything felt a little off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The air had a strange heaviness to it, as though it was thick with something unsaid, something waiting. I'd been out running errands, my mind distracted by the usual daily tasks, groceries, paying bills, picking up dry cleaning. My routine was like clockwork, comforting in its predictability, and yet that day, the world around me felt a little bit wrong. I was walking down Oak Street, a street I'd passed down hundreds of times. The kind of street where nothing ever really changed, where the same storefronts and faded signs had been there for years. But as I walked, something caught my eye. A store. I had never noticed it before, even though I was certain it had been there all along. It wasn't particularly remarkable, just a small, old-fashioned shop wedged between a bakery and a corner cafe. The window display was dusty, the glass slightly fogged, as if no one had bothered to look inside for years. The sign above the door, though faded, read simply, "Oddities and Curios." It wasn't the name that had drawn me in. It was the woman. She was standing by the door, her back to me, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. I don't know why, but I found myself staring at her. She was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the mild weather, her dark hair cascading down her back in waves. There was something about her posture, something graceful yet unnerving. It was as though she didn't belong to this time or place. As if she had stepped out of another world entirely. And then, without turning to look at me, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. I blinked. It all happened so suddenly, so effortlessly, that I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it at all. But I had. She had entered the store. The door had opened as naturally as any door would, and she had vanished inside. I found myself standing there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. I didn't know what had drawn me to it. Curiosity, maybe. But there was something more than that, some odd pull that made me feel as though I had to go in, as though I had to follow her. I walked toward the door, my footsteps slow and deliberate, as if the very act of moving forward was something forbidden. The brass handle glinted in the fading afternoon light, almost too bright against the darkness of the street. When I reached for it, though, I felt a strange hesitation. Something was wrong. The door wasn't there. I stood there, my hand frozen just inches from the space where the handle had been a moment before. I leaned forward, confused, my eyes scanning the spot where the door had been, but there was nothing. No door. No handle. Just a smooth, unbroken wall where the entrance should have been. My pulse quickened. I stepped back, my mind racing. Trying to process what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. I had been standing right there, just moments ago, and the door had been open. I had seen her walk through it. How could it simply be gone now? I reached out, pressing my palm against the smooth surface of the wall where the door should have been. My fingertips brushed against the cold stone, smooth but unyielding. The wall was solid, without any sign of a doorframe, no outline where it had once stood. The sign above the shop, the faded "Oddities and Curios," swayed ever so slightly in the breeze, as if it had always been there, as if nothing had changed. I pulled my hand away from the wall, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I had imagined the door. But that woman, she had been there, hadn't she? She had stepped inside. I hadn't imagined that. I glanced around the street, but there was no one else in sight. The town was eerily quiet, as though the world had paused for a moment, waiting for me to make sense of what was happening. The street lamps flickered slightly, their dull glow adding to the surreal atmosphere. Everything seemed distorted now, like the edges of reality were blurring, slipping out of focus. I stepped back again, staring at the blank wall, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something unnatural about it, something I couldn't explain. The world felt muffled, as if I were underwater, the usual sounds of the city softened by the thick layer of fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The street was quiet, far quieter than it should have been for that time of night, especially in this part of town. There were no cars on the road, no sounds of people talking in their apartments or the distant hum of traffic. Just the occasional rustle of the trees and the soft drumming of raindrops from earlier on the leaves. Even the usual street noise felt somehow distant. As I walked further down the street, I noticed the streetlights were flickering. Nothing new, really. They often flickered here. This area wasn't exactly the best maintained. But tonight, the flickering felt different, like the lights were trying to fight against something. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the shadows stretching in odd ways as I moved down the sidewalk, but then it happened again. One of the streetlights buzzed loudly. It wasn't the usual hum or flicker I had gotten used to. This sound was sharp, almost mechanical, like a broken wire struggling to keep the light alive. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes drawn to the glow of the streetlight overhead. It buzzed again, louder this time, and then there was a strange, unsettling pause. Everything felt still, too still. I thought about walking past, ignoring it, but the light drew me in like something almost familiar. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. The reflection. In the window beside me, I saw her again. The woman, standing just inside the store. Her back was to me, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She was perfectly still, as though waiting for me. But the reflection wasn't right. It was as though she wasn't really inside the store at all, she was simply a reflection of what should have been there, a shadow caught between two worlds. A trick of the glass, something warped and twisted. I spun around, my breath catching in my thr. I kept walking, my breath shallow, and tried not to look back. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The store that wasn't there. The woman who had entered. The reflection that wasn't real. And most of all, the door that disappeared the moment I tried to enter it. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that day, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to return. The store. The door. That woman. And maybe, one day, I'll walk down Oak Street again, and the door will be there. And maybe, just maybe, I'll be able to step through it. But I don't think I'll ever be able to walk away again. It was one of those late afternoons when the light was soft, golden, but already beginning to fade as the sun sank lower behind the horizon. I was walking home after another long day at work, the familiar route stretching before me in a comforting monotony. The air was crisp, the trees just beginning to turn for the fall, and I found myself lost in thought, as I often do on these quiet walks. The world seemed to slow down around me, and the sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk was the only thing that broke the silence. The street was empty, except for a few distant cars and the occasional pedestrian on their way to somewhere else. As I walked, I passed a row of old houses, some well-kept, some with the tired, weathered look of time passing by unnoticed. My apartment wasn't far, just around the corner. But I always took a bit of a detour, savoring the calmness of the evening. It was on this detour that I noticed something odd. I was walking past an old, brick building that had been vacant for as long as I could remember. It used to be a small shop, but the windows were now boarded up, and the door had been chained shut. Yet, somehow, I always noticed the reflection in the windows when I walked by, whether it was the late afternoon light casting long shadows, or something about the stillness of the place that caught my eye. I had never given it much thought until today. As I approached the window, I glanced up, the reflection of the building and the street stretching out before me. But then, something caught my attention, something that shouldn't have been there. I stopped. The reflection of the street, the trees, the empty sidewalk, they were all familiar. But there was something else, something subtle, something that didn't belong. A figure. A shadow, just off to the side in the reflection, standing near the far corner of the window. I turned, my heart jumping in my chest, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. The street was as empty as it had been a moment ago. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the window, my breath quickening. The figure in the reflection hadn't moved, but it was there, unmistakable, darker than the shadow surrounding it, as though it were casting its own presence into the glass. It was a person. A man. His features were indistinct, a blur of darkness where a face should be. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his presence in the reflection, like a weight pressing against the space around me. I took a hesitant step forward, my pulse racing, and as I moved closer, I saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, too tall, and there was something wrong about the way he stood. His posture was too rigid, as though he was trying to blend into the shadows but wasn't quite succeeding. His arms hung at his sides, his fingers unnaturally still, and there was something in his stance that felt off. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat, the world around me seeming to narrow, as if the window itself had drawn me into it. But no matter how far I stepped back, the figure remained. It was still there, in the reflection, its presence unshakable. I looked around again. The street was still empty. No one was behind me. There were no signs of life, just the quiet stillness of the evening. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away, couldn't take my eyes off the window. It felt like I was being drawn into the reflection, as though the figure was pulling me in, beckoning me closer. I stepped back toward the window, my hand shaking slightly as I reached out to touch the glass. The cool surface felt solid beneath my fingertips, but there was something unsettling about the way the reflection seemed to warp, as though it was bending around the edges of the glass. It felt as though the window was no longer just a window, but a thin barrier between two worlds. The figure in the reflection hadn't moved, but somehow, it felt like he was getting closer, like the space between us was shrinking. And then, for the briefest moment, the figure's head tilted. His face, a face I hadn't been able to make out before, became clearer in the reflection. It wasn't a face, not exactly. It was a distortion, an empty shape, like a mask or a shadow, with hollow eyes that seemed to look directly into mine. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It felt alive. It felt like it was staring at me, aware of my every movement, of my every breath. I jerked my hand away from the glass, a cold shiver running through me. I had to get away. This couldn't be happening. I turned quickly, almost stumbling as I tried to walk away, but my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through molasses. I kept my eyes forward, unwilling to glance back at the window. I didn't want to see it again. I didn't want to see that figure, that thing that shouldn't have been there, moving in the reflection. But then, as I turned the corner and the window was out of my line of sight, I heard it. A soft sound, like a whisper, but it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from the window. From the reflection. "You're not alone." The words felt like they were inside my head, reverberating through my thoughts, twisting my perception of reality. I froze mid-step, my breath caught in my throat. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't have come from the window. There was no one there. I forced myself to move, to keep walking, to get as far away as possible, but the whisper followed me. "You're not alone." Louder now, the words echoing in the back of my mind, as if they were pressing into my skull. They felt familiar, but I couldn't place them, couldn't make sense of them. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun had fully set, and the street was dark, the shadows long and stretching across the pavement. I stood in front of the door, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart still racing, the whisper still lingering in my ears. I didn't turn around to look back. But I could feel it. I could feel that presence, the figure from the window, like it was following me, like it was always there, just beyond the edge of my sight. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to shake the image of the figure in the window, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. "You're not alone." The longer I lay there, the more I realized something I hadn't considered before. I had never been alone. The figure wasn't just in the window. It was in the reflection, always there, always watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I walked, no matter how far I ran, the reflection would always follow me. I walked closer, the ground beneath my feet shifting from smooth pavement to rough stone as I stepped onto the narrow path that led into the dark opening. My heart beat a little faster, not out of fear, but from that deep, strange pull, that whispering urge to go further. I was already too close to turn back. I stepped inside. The air was cooler here, the temperature dropping as the sunlight disappeared completely behind the stone walls. The walls of the tunnel were damp, moss creeping along the edges, and the sound of my footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. There was no breeze, no movement in the air, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I kept walking, the path curving gently ahead, the darkness growing thicker as I moved further in. It was strange, I thought. The tunnel felt so familiar, like I had walked through it many times before. I didn't know why, but that feeling wouldn't leave me. Something about the tunnel felt like home, like it belonged to me. I felt a tug in my chest, an odd sense of déjà vu that made my pulse quicken. I walked deeper, but something was starting to shift. The tunnel was changing, subtly at first. The walls seemed to close in, the air thicker now, almost suffocating. The faintest echo of footsteps began to fill the space, my footsteps, but somehow delayed, as if there were two of me walking in sync. It was as though the tunnel was stretching on forever, yet at the same time, it felt like I wasn't going anywhere at all. And then, without warning, I stopped. The tunnel had shifted. I didn't know how or why, but I found myself standing in the exact same spot where I had started. The same damp walls, the same dark arch above me. The only difference was that the light from outside, which had been faint, now seemed even farther away. It was as if the tunnel had folded in on itself. I blinked, trying to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping over me. My mind couldn't make sense of it. I was sure I had walked further in, deeper into the tunnel. But here I was, standing at the entrance again, the opening of the tunnel stretching before me like it had when I first arrived. I turned around, half expecting to see the tunnel stretching ahead of me, but no. It was just darkness behind me. I could still feel the same pull, the same beckoning, like the tunnel wanted me to move forward, to go deeper. But I hesitated. Something was wrong. I took a few steps back, unsure if I was moving in the right direction. The air felt thicker now, more oppressive. The same feeling that had tugged at me earlier had transformed into something heavier, something more insistent. It was as though the tunnel itself was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. I stepped back again, and once more, I was standing in the exact same spot. The entrance was behind me, but it wasn't where it had been before. It was closer now, so close that I could have reached out and touched the opening. Yet, I hadn't moved forward. I hadn't walked back that far. How could it be that I was closer to the entrance when I hadn't even taken a step in that direction? I turned again, frantic now, but the tunnel was still the same. The walls felt tighter, the air thicker, and that same unsettling feeling crept up my spine. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnel wasn't just a tunnel anymore, it was a trap, a labyrinth with no way out. I took a step forward. I should have been moving deeper into the tunnel, but as I did, I felt that same familiar sensation of stepping backward, as though I was going in the wrong direction. I glanced over my shoulder to see the entrance, right behind me, impossibly close, like I was never meant to leave. The tunnel was swallowing me, pulling me back in, no matter how much I tried to escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The air was thick, heavy with a presence that I couldn't escape. I turned back again, and in that instant, I realized something. I had never truly entered the tunnel at all. I was still standing at the entrance. The moment I had stepped forward, I had crossed into a space where time and space didn't work the way they should. The tunnel had twisted around itself, looping me back into the same spot, over and over, until I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or backward. I couldn't tell if I had entered the tunnel or if it had entered me. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I was suffocating in the quiet, in the endless loop, the weight of the tunnel pressing in on me from all sides. I felt like I was slipping away, trapped in a moment that refused to let me go. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself entirely, the walls began to shift once more. The tunnel widened, the darkness receded, and the air cleared. I took a deep breath, disoriented, and looked around. The entrance was gone, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what was real anymore. But I knew one thing for certain: I had never really entered the tunnel. I had never truly left. And now, the tunnel was everywhere. It was inside me. It was outside me. It was in the air I breathed. And I would never be free. It was an ordinary morning, like any other. I boarded the bus, my mind still foggy from lack of sleep, barely registering the usual sounds, the hum of the engine, the murmur of quiet conversations, the occasional stop-and-go shuffle of passengers. It was one of those days where I didn't feel like facing the world fully. My routine was comforting in its monotony, a predictable series of motions that helped me navigate the mornings when I could hardly keep my eyes open. The bus was half full, the seats mostly taken by the same people I saw every day. I sat down by the window, leaning my head against the cool glass, letting my gaze drift out to the world rushing past. The usual city streets, familiar landmarks, the humdrum of the morning commute. Nothing worth noting, nothing that felt out of place. But then, she sat down next to me. At first, I didn't even notice her. She slid into the seat with a quiet grace, so effortless it almost felt as though she belonged to the bus itself, like she had always been there. It wasn't until she glanced over at me that I noticed her at all. Her smile was soft, almost shy, but it had a warmth to it that felt strangely comforting. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back in gentle waves. Her features were delicate, her skin pale but smooth, almost luminous. The kind of face you would easily forget in a crowd, yet somehow, you wouldn't. She had that quiet presence, the kind that made you wonder if there was more to her than you could immediately see. I smiled back, trying to shake off the grogginess still lingering in my mind. She didn't speak, just gave me that soft, knowing smile before turning her attention back to the bus window. I glanced at her again, but it was as if the moment had already passed. She seemed lost in her thoughts, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery. I turned back to the window, trying to go back to my quiet stupor, but something tugged at my attention. There was something off, something strange about the way she was sitting. I couldn't quite place it, but the air around her felt thicker. As if a subtle tension had settled between us. I looked back at her, really looked at her this time, and that's when I saw it. Her reflection in the window. It didn't match her at all. I don't know what it was that made me notice it, but once I did, I couldn't unsee it. Her reflection, just behind her, in the dark glass, was facing away from me. Completely turned. She was smiling at me, but her reflection was looking straight ahead, gazing out into the passing street, not acknowledging me at all. I blinked, confused. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light or my half-asleep state. But the longer I stared at it, the more unsettling it became. Her reflection didn't seem right. It was as though it wasn't truly hers, like it was someone else entirely, a stranger who happened to look like her, but wasn't her. I turned my head quickly, almost involuntarily, to look directly at her. She was still there, her eyes on the window, her smile gentle, the same warmth in her expression. But her reflection, still turned away, still facing the other direction. It was like I was seeing two different versions of her, one alive and smiling at me, the other cold, distant, and somehow wrong. I tried to shake off the creeping discomfort, telling myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the angle of the reflection was odd, or maybe I hadn't fully woken up. I took a deep breath, glanced back at the window again. And nothing had changed. Her reflection was still facing away from me. Still disconnected. A strange chill ran through me, and for a moment, I felt the urge to get off the bus, to escape whatever was happening in that moment. But I couldn't move. It was as if the image was frozen in my mind, the unsettling dissonance between the woman's smile and the absence of it in the reflection too overpowering to ignore. My stomach twisted. I turned back to face her, but I was too afraid to look at the reflection again. I could feel it now, like something was lurking in that glass, just beyond my sight. That reflection wasn't just an image of her, it was something else, something darker, as if it knew things I didn't. I could almost feel the eyes of the reflection on me, even though it was turned away. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the sounds of the bus, the hum of the engine, the chatter of other passengers. But my gaze kept drifting back to her, and the reflection in the window. The two versions of her seemed to stretch the space between us, pulling at the fabric of the moment, as though reality itself was beginning to unravel. Finally, the bus reached my stop. I stood up, my legs shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to leave, to get off the bus and put the strange discomfort behind me, but something held me there. I glanced at her one last time before I stepped toward the exit. She hadn't noticed. She was still staring out the window, still smiling that same soft, distant smile. But her reflection was now gone. The window was completely empty, the reflection of the seat beside me showing only the darkened street and the bus's interior lights. I stepped off the bus, the doors closing behind me with a soft whoosh, and as the bus pulled away, I glanced back one last time. She was still there, sitting silently, her head turned toward the window. But I could feel it then, the absence of her reflection, the hollow space where it had been. And I realized, in that moment, that I had never truly seen her. She had never smiled at me at all. Her reflection had always faced away. I don't know if she was real, or if she was ever truly there. But I do know that the next time I ride the bus, I'll be watching the reflections very carefully. It was one of those days where nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary, but you couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was heavy, thick with humidity, and the sky had that dull, washed-out gray that made everything seem distant. I had a few errands to run in the city, nothing important, just the usual things that make up the blur of daily life. A few items to pick up, some bills to pay. I walked down the familiar streets, the same streets I'd walked down 100 times before, without thinking twice. The clatter of city life surrounded me, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the occasional horn of a car cutting through the noise. My mind was occupied with mundane thoughts. I wasn't paying much attention, but I could feel the weight of the world around me in the air. As I passed the corner near the old theater, I saw it. A large billboard looming above the street, stretching across the sky like some kind of monument. It was an ad for a new movie, bright, colorful, and designed to catch the eye. I'd seen it before, the same image displayed for weeks. The same actors, the same tagline in bold letters. It was a formulaic ad, something you'd see 100 times a day in the city. But today, for some reason, it caught my eye more than it usually did. As I walked, I glanced up at it, barely registering the familiar image of the smiling actors in the movie's poster. Except this time, the billboard didn't show the actors. It didn't show the movie at all. It showed me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The face staring down from the billboard wasn't the movie stars, wasn't the ad that had been up there for weeks. It was my face. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or some glitch in the ad system. Maybe it was just some odd display malfunction, some strange coincidence. But no. The image of me, standing still on the billboard, stared down at me with unnerving clarity. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't posing for a camera. The expression on my face was something I didn't recognize, something cold, distant, and almost haunting. I froze there, on the sidewalk, staring up at the billboard. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a chill creeping down my spine. It felt like a moment stretching out too long, as though time itself had slowed. I knew that face. It was mine, of course, it was mine, but I couldn't understand how it had gotten there. I took a few hesitant steps closer to the billboard, my heart hammering in my chest. The crowd around me moved as usual, people chatting on their phones, hurrying to their destinations, but no one else seemed to notice the glaring change. They walked past me, oblivious, while I stood frozen, my gaze locked on the image. There was no mistaking it. The image was clear, far too vivid to be an accident. It was my face. It was me, yet not me. There was something about the expression, something hollow in those eyes, that made me feel like I was looking at a stranger, like I had no control over it. Like it was me, but it wasn't. I started walking again, unable to pull my eyes away from the screen, as though the billboard had some magnetic force drawing me in. I was disoriented, my thoughts a blur. I had to find a way to make sense of it. Maybe it was an advertisement I had been a part of, something I'd forgotten about. But I had no memory of agreeing to anything like this. I reached the building directly beneath the billboard and glanced up at the digital control panel, the one that changed the ads at regular intervals. There was no one there, just a dark window, the reflection of the gray sky outside. I tried to rationalize it. It must have been a mix-up. Maybe it was a campaign featuring regular people, and somehow, my photo was used without my knowledge. But I couldn't stop staring at it. The longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the fact that my face was on the billboard. It was the details, the little things that didn't add up. The clothes I was wearing weren't the ones I had on that day. The background wasn't anywhere I recognized, and the expression in my eyes, it felt wrong. It felt too familiar, yet like something I had never seen before. As I stood there, the air seemed to grow heavier, the city around me blurring. The world felt out of sync, like the edges of reality were fraying. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be staring at me, to have noticed what was happening. But no one was paying attention. Everyone was too busy with their own lives, too distracted to notice what was right in front of them. I took a few steps back, my pulse racing, and the image on the billboard shifted. It flickered, the lights dimming for a brief moment before coming back to life. And when it did, I saw something that made my heart stop. The face on the billboard wasn't just looking at me anymore. It was looking down at the street. At the crowd. At the people walking by. At me. It wasn't just an image anymore. It was watching me. It was aware of me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me as panic started to set in. I looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But everything felt wrong. The city around me felt like a stage, and I was nothing but a character in a play I didn't understand. I ran. I don't know why, but I couldn't stand still anymore. I needed to get away from the billboard, from that face. I ran down the street, turning corners, dodging pedestrians, my mind whirling in panic. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air itself was pressing against me. I didn't stop running until I reached the subway entrance, breathless and trembling. My hands were shaking as I gripped the rail, trying to steady myself. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, and I couldn't get my thoughts to settle. I took the subway home, my mind still reeling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my face staring back at me from the billboard, watching me, tracking my every move. I told myself it was just a coincidence. It was just a glitch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I tried to push it from my mind. I tried to sleep, to pretend like nothing had happened. But when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't resist looking outside. I opened the window, and there it was. The billboard. The same ad, the same movie poster. But this time, it was as if nothing had changed. The face was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somehow, watching me. Waiting. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know how my face ended up on that billboard, or how it seemed so alive. But I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop wondering if it will happen again. If the face will come back. If it's already waiting for me. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I had moved to the city just a few months ago. It seemed like the perfect place, a bustling, modern metropolis, full of opportunities, energy, and excitement. I was ready to start fresh, to escape the quiet, small town I grew up in. I thought I'd find my rhythm here, in the chaos of urban life. And for a while, it was exactly what I'd hoped for. The streets were always alive, the buzz of people and traffic never stopped. Restaurants, cafes, shops, every corner was something new, something to explore. It wasn't perfect, of course, but there was a sense of promise in the air, like everything I wanted could be found in this city if I just kept looking. But lately, there had been a change. A subtle one, at first. At first, it was just a feeling, an odd disquiet that seemed to settle over me as I walked through the streets. It was hard to place, like the city itself was shifting in some way I couldn't understand. The familiar hum of the city felt off. The noises in the streets seemed muted, as if the world was pressing down on me, squeezing everything into a smaller space. One evening, things took a turn. I had been working late at the office, the last one left in the building. I'd promised myself I'd get home early, but it was always the same story, one more task, one more thing to fix, one more email to send. By the time I finally gathered my things and stepped out into the streets, the sun had already set, and the city was cloaked in darkness. I knew the route to my apartment by heart now, so I walked with the rhythm of someone familiar with their surroundings, but tonight, the streets felt unfamiliar. The dim streetlights flickered as I passed under them, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. The sidewalks were empty, almost eerily so. I had grown used to the crowds and the noise of late-night city life, but tonight, it was as if everyone had vanished. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the time, but when I looked at the screen, I noticed something strange. The signal bars were completely empty. No bars. No service. I paused, staring at the screen, confused. It wasn't like the phone was out of range, I had been using it just fine throughout the day. I tried to refresh the signal, to make a call, but there was nothing. Just an empty, unresponsive display. I checked the network settings, turned airplane mode on and off, but nothing worked. I tried calling my friend to ask if they were having the same issue. The call failed immediately. I tried again. And again. It was the same. I stood there on the empty street, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the cold evening air sharp in my lungs. This wasn't right. The city was known for its connectivity, everyone had a signal here. How could this happen? I turned down another street, hoping maybe there was a dead zone, some brief interference. But as I walked, the problem persisted. My phone still couldn't find a signal, still couldn't connect. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine, chalking it up to a minor glitch. But the longer I walked, the more the city seemed to close in around me. It wasn't just the lack of a signal. It was the silence. The streets were empty, and the usual noise, the constant hum of traffic, distant conversations, the occasional siren or horn, had vanished. There was nothing. No sound, just the echo of my footsteps reverberating against the concrete. The buildings loomed over me, their windows dark, as though the entire city had stopped breathing. I quickened my pace, my footsteps growing louder in the stillness. I tried to call someone again, anyone, but nothing. The city felt like it was becoming a void, and I was the only one left inside it. Panic began to set in. I reached for my phone again, desperate now, swiping through my contacts, hoping for something to break the silence. But there was nothing. No bars. No service. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it's just a glitch in the system. I kept thinking. It'll come back. I'm sure it will. But it didn't. The further I walked, the more it felt like the city was shrinking around me. I reached the intersection, where the subway station was usually bustling with commuters, but tonight, it was completely empty. No lines of people waiting for the train. No one rushing to catch a ride. Just the cold, empty platform, the harsh light casting long shadows along the walls. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I needed to get to my apartment. I needed to get somewhere familiar, somewhere that felt safe. I turned onto the street where my building stood, just a few blocks away now. I kept walking faster, but my footsteps seemed to echo more than usual. The empty street seemed to grow longer, the shadows darker. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the block, in front of my building, was a man. He was standing still, facing away from me. I didn't recognize him, and something about the way he stood, so still, so unnatural, set off an alarm in my mind. I walked faster, my heart racing now, but the closer I got to him, the further away he seemed to move. He wasn't walking, wasn't moving at all, but he was getting further from me. It was as though the distance between us was stretching, like I was trapped in a loop, like time itself was being manipulated. I opened the window, and there it was. The billboard. The same ad, the same movie poster. But this time, it was as if nothing had changed. The face was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, somehow, watching me. Waiting. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know how my face ended up on that billboard, or how it seemed so alive. But I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop wondering if it will happen again. If the face will come back. If it's already waiting for me. I reached into my pocket again, my hands trembling, and checked my phone once more. Still nothing. I tried to call 911, hoping that maybe I could still reach help. But the call didn't even go through. It failed. I dialed again. Nothing. And that's when I realized, it wasn't just the signal that was gone. It was the city. The city itself had stopped. The streets were empty. No one was around. No sounds, no people, no life. I stumbled backward, my head spinning, my hands shaking. The world around me felt like it was caving in. It wasn't just that I couldn't reach anyone, it was that there was no one left to reach. I turned to run, to get away from whatever was happening, but it didn't matter. The city was closing in on me. My phone was useless. My calls were unanswered. The city had turned into a cold, lifeless shell, and I was trapped inside it. I don't know how long I wandered through the empty streets. Time blurred, and my mind became a mess of panic and confusion. The last thing I remember clearly is the overwhelming sensation that something was watching me. That the city was aware of my every step, but it wasn't letting me leave. Now, I can't tell if I'm still here. My phone still doesn't work, and I can't seem to reach anyone. I keep walking through the empty streets, and I keep looking for signs of life, but I'm not sure if I'll find them again. I tried to call for help. But the city didn't have any signal. It was the kind of morning that promised the promise of something new. The air had that crisp, early spring bite, and the streets were alive with people heading to their routines. I had just moved to the city a few weeks ago. The bustling crowds, the steady hum of life in every corner, everything felt different, yet comforting. There was a sense of movement in the air, the city constantly in motion, pushing forward, never pausing. My walk to work usually took me past the town square. I'd never paid much attention to the clock tower that stood there at the center, but it had always been there, like a solid landmark in the middle of the square. Old, weathered, and seemingly untouched by time, it was a relic from an era I couldn't remember but had heard about, something that had witnessed the rise and fall of the town. The clock tower stood tall, a stone sentinel, its face an intricate design, the hands of the clock forever set in place. I never thought much of it. The bells that rang every hour were a familiar sound, a comforting rhythm that filled the silence of the city's mornings. But on this day, everything changed. It started when I noticed her. She was standing just off to the side of the square, a woman in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, dressed in a long dark coat. Her hair was dark, falling loosely around her shoulders, and her face was calm, almost serene. But what caught my attention, what made me pause for a moment, was her eyes. They were wide, too wide, as though they had seen something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. For a moment, I hesitated. Something about her felt out of place, like she didn't quite belong. But she was just standing there, looking at the clock tower, her gaze fixed on it as if it was the most important thing in the world. Then, she raised her arm and pointed. It wasn't a casual gesture, but something deliberate, intentional. Her finger stretched towards the clock tower, and I followed the direction of her hand. I couldn't look away. The clock tower was still the same as always, an imposing structure, standing proudly against the skyline. But this time, something was wrong. Something felt off. The clock face, familiar yet alien, stood there in silence, as it always had. But now, I noticed it clearly. The hands. The clock had no hands. Nothing. Just a hollow face, empty and still. The minute and hour hands were gone, leaving the clock a frozen void, as if time itself had been erased from it. I stared at the blank space where the hands should have been, a strange unease creeping up my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt a chill run through me. Something about the absence of the hands felt deliberate, like the clock wasn't broken, but intentionally made to be this way. As if it had been designed to show nothing, to represent a moment where time no longer mattered. I turned back to the woman, and she was still standing there. Her arm pointed at the clock tower, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though she could see something I couldn't. I took a hesitant step forward, my curiosity overtaking the strange sense of dread that had settled over me. I had to know what was going on. There had to be an explanation, some simple answer that would make sense of the scene unfolding before me. I walked toward her, my footsteps slow and cautious, as though the very ground beneath my feet might shift. As I got closer, I noticed her lips moving, but no sound came out. Her mouth moved in rhythm, like she was saying something, but the words were swallowed by the space between us. The silence between us was oppressive, thick with the kind of tension you feel just before something awful happens. I was only a few feet away when I stopped, unsure if I should speak, unsure of what to say. She finally turned her head towards me, her gaze never leaving the clock tower, her finger still pointed at the empty face. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the city. I didn't answer right away, my eyes still glued to the empty clock. "See what?" I asked, the question barely leaving my lips. Her lips curved into a faint smile, something unsettling about it, like she knew something I didn't. "The time," she said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "It's frozen. The hands, they're missing, but it's not a mistake. It's intentional." I frowned. "It's just a clock."